The first time you see the climax of a person dying with OFIO can be kind of shocking. Well, shocking is an understatement. The fact is, watching someone's head burst open from fungus inflammation is quite frankly the kind of thing that haunts your nightmares for a while, but you kind of become numb to it after seeing it happen multiple times. The good news is that their brain function has been gone for a few days, so I don't think they feel anything at that point. I'm not completely sure. The lack of a reaction would indicate to me that they aren't in a lot of pain. At least, I don't really know. It was about 3 months ago, and it was a guy that I really didn't know all that well, though that fact doesn't necessarily lessen the impact. First, the head gets puffy, like an allergic reaction to a bee sting. Then there is the bruising, which starts out as small spots, then steadily grows to the size of continents on a world map. This continues until the head is purple, then darker purple like a ripe plum. At this point, the head is roughly twice the size of normal. With no place left to go, the tissue and body fluids leave each orifice, following the path of least resistance. A bead of blood and pus mixture forms a circle around the eyes. The blood then squirts like a grapefruit being punctured. Blood pours out the nose like a faucet. Finally, the eyes pop out of their sockets, and the scalp tears open from the top of the head to the base of the skull, until the contents of the victim's head have all escaped their confinement in a mess of sangrient stew. Many years ago, the Earth arrived at a place where the atmosphere had become so full of carbon. The heat and tumultuous weather patterns destroyed a lot of plant and animal life, our sources for food essentially. Humans can be pretty resourceful in a crisis, so with no other alternative, we came together to put forth sustainable options to keep us going. And because insects like crickets and ants were thriving and plentiful, they became a staple of our contemporary diet. It was the ants. Those damn ants started it all. There's a fungus by the name of Ophiocordyceps unilateralis. Jungle ants would eat this fungus and become infected. After the first few days, the infection would expand into the brain, leaving the ant in a catatonic state. They are called zombie ants because they are conscious and mobile. Usually between day 6 through 8, the infection pushed its way out, causing the brain to blow apart. Nobody ever dreamed in a million years that by ingesting ants with the infection, humans would become the host, or that they would suffer through the process in the exact same manner. We now refer to the infection as just OFIO, for simplicity's sake. A lot of people have objections to terms like zombies or zooks. They argue that they're still people we know and love, but I honestly don't think it matters anymore. When society has collapsed, is there any point in going around correcting people anymore? As far as getting some control over the spread of infection, that has proven to be almost insurmountable challenge. You can try and be selective about which ants you consume, or even if you eat any ants at all, but they've basically become deconstructed and incorporated into all food foundations these days, so it's hard to separate them completely. Oh, and here's the real scary part. When the infected reach the point of mindlessness, they get really hungry. No, they won't try to eat your brains, but they will straight up bite off one of your fingers, even if they know you. The infection then moves along from one person to the next. At the beginning of the end, it was just my mom and I. Well, it was always just the two of us anyway. We lived together all our lives, and we were just fine. We never needed anyone else. But recent events caused us to think about what we would need to do to survive. The world became every man for himself, so it seemed as though we weren't going to survive by just waiting around and trying to collect scraps, because there would simply be no scraps left to collect. We would need to form an alliance with others. There were a lot of expectations when the apocalypse began, but for a variety of reasons all our expectations were dashed. What we had was this expectation of an apocalyptic world being like the Wild West, where lots of people would find it easy or even fun to go around and hunt zombies. That may be true for a small minority of sociopaths wandering the streets, but the reality is that these are the same people with whom we all had close relationships, our friends and families, people we went to school or work with. This is where things get complicated, and this is the reason why I find myself in the current predicament. We initially started breaking off into groups or tribes. They were usually formed based on familial relationships, with the goal of defending resources and providing for one another. It should come as no surprise that we fought a lot, both internally and with other groups. After all, humans are nothing if not predictable. The first ideas for where we would go to seek sanctuary were the large retail warehouses like Costco or Sam's. That made sense to me. You have a structure with a concrete tilt-up wall that would provide security, a place that is already well stocked with food and emergency supplies, and the Zooks can't get in without a membership. I found out through the School of Hard Knocks that it's actually an incredibly dumb idea to go hole up in a Costco. It turns out that it's not a novel idea, and that the rest of the world thought of the same thing. When the warehouse store becomes overcrowded, there is no space to escape any single infected person stuck inside the building. Also, it kind of seems like most of the people who had chosen to go there were some of the most selfish and hot-headed people left on the planet. I don't really know how some people with Ophio slipped in among our group in the store, but it's reasonable that it could happen, given that there are no early symptoms that are obvious to the victim or anyone else. Well, they got in, they lost their brain function, and they sparked a few dramatic events in the store. In one instance, we could hear this blood-curdling scream coming from the next aisle down, as someone realized that the person next to them was suddenly trying to bite off a chunk of flesh from their arm. I made mention earlier about the hotheads in the store. They argued that we had to basically execute anyone immediately if they showed symptoms. Thankfully, these people represented only the more vocal minority among us. The more reasonable majority decided on an approach that would work for everyone. Basically, if someone in your immediate family, or over whom you had guardianship, was found to be infected, you were given two options. Option 1, they could be killed almost immediately by a pre-approved method of the victim's choice. Some legal documents and disclosures were needed to be signed well in advance. Option 2, if choice 1 was not selected, both them and their families would agree to leave the group permanently, and they were on their own. As with any proposed law or ordinance, the way it is written is great in theory, but in practice it becomes much more messy. It's easy for me to tell my mom to go with option 1 in the event that I'm infected, but it would be unfair to her because she is the one to do the deed. One evening, we're settling into our top bunk retail rack, and Mom is facing me. She is recounting good memories from my childhood in a whisper. As she gets into detail about one story in particular, Mom starts to wander off on an incoherent tangent. She slurs her words, and sometimes stops for a minute or two, losing her train of thought completely. My heart cramps up as I suddenly realize that the unthinkable has happened. Mom has Ophio. Sometime shortly thereafter, we are standing in front of a makeshift council in the middle of the warehouse. Mom had already made up her mind and signed the appropriate documents. We were supposed to have completed the execution already. I made pleas with everyone there to let us leave together instead. Mom isn't of sound mind, so she can't really object. Some people don't really like the idea of keeping the rules for some and making objections for others. But at the end of the day, the only thing anyone cares about is that we are far away from them. Now it's on to Plan B. In hindsight, Plan B was always the better plan, but hindsight is 20/20, as they say. The plan is to get into our old Ford truck with some camping gear and head up somewhere remote at the top of the Rocky Mountains. The idea of doing this is that the infected aren't likely to go trudging up a mountain aimlessly for food. When the weather turns cold, those who are scattered along the mountainside will be frozen and stationary. Luckily, before we departed, I had some assistance in tying up my mom so that she could ride in the cab without being a danger to me. I spent the drive up the canyon racked with grief. I had my mother by my side and she was alive, but we couldn't talk to each other, which would have been just the therapy I needed. What was I doing? Did I actually have hope where there was none? The truth is that I was a coward, and I was keeping her alive for my own selfish purposes. But that's really the reason why this world-ending event has even been allowed to persist, and eventually take over. It's because we were all cowards. We watch all of our loved ones become infected and die, then we do absolutely nothing about it because we are too scared to do anything else. All of the human characteristics that would normally be celebrated, love, kindness, pacifism, were ironically the things that would spell our doom. I didn't feel like it was right to keep Mom in the cab of the truck once we got to camp. I could let her roam semi-free if she was tethered to the trailer hitch with a chain. I could feed her a lot easier that way as well. Sometimes I wondered if Mom was still there in her head, even though she spent a lot of time during the day lunging at me from the end of the chain like a rabid dog. There were times when I could see into her eyes, and I could swear that I caught glimpses of that expression of loving kindness I'd grown so used to before. We were coming up on day 7 of the infection. Mom would either face the last stage of the infection, or she would kick this thing by pure strength of will. The sun was setting in a pale vermilion glow behind the silhouette of the forest trees, and I had made a fire. As I stared into the flames, I continued my long, one-way conversation with Mom. Out of nowhere, I started to hear the sounds of scooting dirt and breaking twigs. They were pretty faint at first, but grew loud and violent quickly. I must have accidentally settled on a campground that wasn't as remote as I initially thought, because 2 infected people suddenly rose up from the horizon to come after me. These aren't your typical zombies from the movies who will stumble and limp clumsily toward you while you think of a way to escape. They will run full sprint if they are hungry enough. My first thought was to get to the cab and close myself inside, but I could feel them bearing down on me so fast, there wasn't time to open the door and shut it behind me. I was sure to be tackled the moment I put my hand on the door handle. Instead, I did a baseball slide under the truck. I turned myself around so that my boots were facing my attackers. My last line of defense was to either kick at them or throw the rocks that were within reach. The dust from their swinging limbs filled the air all around us. I didn't want to give up, but there was no way out of this. "Mom, help!" Mom had gotten down on the ground and wedged herself in between the others. She used all of her strength to grab and push the others out of the way. She was actually fighting them off. I don't believe it. Her motherly instincts were intact. Mom was saving me. When I finally felt like I had obtained my salvation at the hands of my mother, I suddenly felt a sharp stabbing pain in my leg. I screamed out in pain. I looked down and found my mother chewing on a sinewy piece of my ankle.